The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. This was my pick, and it sounds like everybody loved it unreservedly. That's great. And it's hard to, as mentioned, get into the book because I suppose a part of reading this book is the experience of trying to piece together exactly what's happening. I guess I can talk about the structure. There's 4 chapters, and it does that thing with that Faulkner uses where it's uncertain what time it is, it's uncertain if it really happened. So that's a part of this novel as well. But the 4 chapters are broken into 4 different dates. The first one being April 7th, 1928, told through the eyes of Ben, one of the Compson children, who I'll get into more later. Then it jumps backwards to June 2nd, 1910, told by Quentin, one of the sons as well, Ben's brother. Then it goes forward in time again through the eyes of Jason, another one of the siblings, on April 6th, 1928. And then it ends April 8th, that's one day after Ben's tale, told through the eyes of a narrator. So as far as summarizing the actual plot of the novel, the best I came up with is there was a once fortunate family named the Compsons that seems to be living in a decaying estate in the American South. And one central event in this novel was that I picked from Caddy, the one sibling that is a female. She was found to be, I suppose, promiscuous, at least for the times and her age, and she marries a man named Herbert, a supposed banker but possible con man. The event is connected to her brother Quentin, the one I'd mentioned in the past, the one of the second chapter, as the Compson family sold a portion of that estate, their pasture, in order to fund both Caddy's wedding and a Harvard education for Quentin. But he is rather racked with trauma that I think is centered around his sister's sexuality, him being a parent virgin, and in my theory, literature's first possible incel, and it leads him to eventually commit suicide by drowning. The other brother, Jason, is found to be rather villainous. He is promised a job by Caddy's husband, Herbert, at a bank, but it never materializes after their own marriage, Herbert and Caddy's, that is, quickly dissolves. And he holds that resentment over her head for a lifetime, even after Caddy leaves their child, or her child, a daughter that she names after her brother Quentin, further adding confusion to the novel, to be raised at the Compson home. And we find out that Jason is stealing the money that Caddy sends for her daughter's upkeep and swindles his own mother into thinking they are ceremoniously burning it, while he, in fact, is cashing these checks. Quentin, the daughter now, is also seemingly somewhat promiscuous, taking after her mother. She eventually breaks into Jason's room, stealing the money that he was both saving as a store clerk and the money stolen from her mother. Jason chases after them, but in vain, leaving the story trailing off with him being robbed, the Great Depression and stock market crash just around the corner. The end. So I'm sure I missed a big part of it. I didn't name a bunch of characters, the help, the mother, the father, all this stuff. But I suppose I'll just start with what you thought of the actual book. I suppose it was tough to get through, and like the first chapter is told through the eyes of Ben, who is like a severely mental debilitated person. I think they mentioned that he has the intelligence of a 3-year-old, though. Who knows what that means, though he does have a rich inner life. And then it trails on to a more stream of conscious form that Quentin tells a more straight-laced narrative with Jason until finally a third-person narrative form. But I thought, like, personally, I thought that Jason was like one of literature's great villains. He was so unlikable. It was intense reading his chapter. What did you all think?
I think I read that Faulkner said he was one of the most evil, not the most evil character he ever dealt with.
I think the first thing to maybe address is, right, it goes back to the very day before the first chapter, April 6th, which is the Evil Brothers chapter, right? And then it goes to April 8th, which seems to focus on Dilsey, who's the grandmother of the black family that, is the help for the Compsons. And the novel progressively gets easier to read, kind of goes in, with a modernist novel, you would maybe expect it to be easier to read at the beginning and then...
Well, except that at the beginning, the first chapter is the voice of a guy who's mentally challenged, so you're not going to get something that's easy from him.
Right, but why structure it that way? I mean,
why not?
I think as a historic, because it's incredibly difficult to get into as a first chapter. Now, I think that has to be part of the point, right?
Yes and no. I mean, yes and no. And I you can't really ever say what's the point of a given novel because you're not inside the writer's head. Every novel has a point for existing. And in terms of, why start a given novel with such a difficult chapter, writing from the point of view of somebody who's mentally disabled, I mean, to me, as a writer, I think that's just an incredibly, amazingly challenging thing to do, of course, but also fascinating. Getting into that, now, do we write in order to make the reader happy, or do we write to investigate and bring out things that they have never seen before or know anything of? So I don't know if the argument that it's so difficult is a good argument as to why to start it. I think it's a fascinating choice on his part to start the book from the point of view of somebody who's mentally challenged, mentally disabled.
So I do have thought as far as why he chose to structure it this way, or at least I'm assuming I read this somewhere because I certainly don't have the capacity to think this up myself. But in that first chapter, it seems that you almost get, like you mentioned, Daniel, the outline of the plot in its entirety. You just have to stitch it together because it's coming from such a weird perspective. But in that way, even though we defined the chapters in terms of days, Benji doesn't seem to be living in this linear, constant time frame, right? We get bits and pieces of the entire Compson history, it seems, filtered through his eyes and his experiences.
Yeah, obviously the novel is incredibly preoccupied with time, and the fact that Benji can't really process time, jumps back and forward in time. I mean, the thing that's really striking about his stream of consciousness is that he's barely existing in the present. He's like always jumping back to something in the past and sort of reliving it.
Well, I mean, time for Benji is only in the present. There is no past and future. There is no this happened yesterday. It's happening now, because of his mental.
So one of the thoughts that I had, because I kept trying to figure out which sequence would have been better, because I thought, God, anything but that first chapter. But the storytelling from Benji's point of view, while it's unclear, it's almost objective. And it leaves so much out that it creates like this incredible sense of like, what the hell is going on? And when is this happening? And why is he saying this? And, the leaves and what does this mean? And you're reading through it and you're left with a lot of kind of suspense, but also a lot of confusion. And then I think you can't read this book once. I think you have to read it maybe like 3 times, and I read it twice. So I read it once and I listened to it once. So I think it being a story in which you begin with so much confusion about what is going on. And if you can hold the facts of what is going on in your head, having no real way to connect them and make a story out of them and hold them as a narrative, but just sort of know that these are these experiences, then read through the actual experiences in a more narrative form, you start to see something you start to be able to piece together what's happening, and you get Benji as being almost like the Christ figure. I know I feel like I say this a lot, but almost like the moral, not the compass, but he kind of reflects back everybody's own stuff. And it's one of those things where, when you're kind of going through the traumas of your life, of your childhood, it's very messy. It's these random experiences, and you don't know what they mean, and you don't know how they affect you, and you don't understand how it's all shaped you. And I feel like that's why he had to start with Benji, because it's a story, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like it just was all the way depressing all the way through. There is no upside here. There's like no good beauty. There's nothing, like you don't read it and you think, oh, I get it. That was beautiful. Because I certainly did not. I just thought it was really, really good at conveying deep, deep dysfunction, and how all the various things that he touches on in this book can really fuck up a family, and how Benji serves as this person to just sort of give really strange and discrete facts about it, but then you have to fill in the blanks with all of the other chapters.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned, though, you don't see any good in the novel, which kind of led me to ask everyone's opinion of Quentin, am I saying that right? Quentin or Quinton, or how do you guys say that? Quentin, okay. The brother.
Quentin, yeah.
So was there any like moral goodness in him, or was he just a crazy person living in a time where, honor was on the way out and he just didn't get the
No.
message? I thought his tale of trying to help the poor little immigrant girl was somewhat sweet, but it was foreshadowing and thematically connected to obviously his deep, weird sexual traumas. Yeah, I would just, you ask a random person, let's just like be as objective as possible. You find out your sister is sleeping around. And obviously we can't be in the same mindset because we're not living in the 20s. But I mean, I'm trying to think of the worst thing ever that my sister could bring, as shame upon my family. And there's nothing that could happen where I commit suicide.
Well, I don't know if the exact reason he committed suicide. I mean, I think a lot of it also had to do, I know that, remember in that section, that discussion or the conversation between him and his father, I think, I'm not saying that, I think there were a number of elements that contributed to it. But I think one of them, mostly was, the primary one was Caddy and her behavior, because he was very moralistic. He felt honor was really something that was very important to him, and it's gone.
But like he's, you think about it, he's a crazy person. Like you get glimpses of his actions, and he's like at a bar drinking with friends, and he freaks out and says, "Do you have a sister?" and starts beating people up. Like, like he needs help, obviously. And yeah,
well,
I think you're right.
Wasn't there an element also of the incestuous,
Well, my understanding, because that always weirded me out, and I also had to read the novel twice, and my understanding is him saying, "Father, I've committed incest," is a way to cover up his sister's shame of being promiscuous and like taking that upon himself. I don't think there was actual incest committed unless someone's interpreting it that way.
No, I agree. I think it was not actual incest, and I don't know. I don't know if it was all because he was covering up for his sister. I kind of always wondered, was there some kind of strange conflict within himself about how he felt about his sister? Maybe he had feelings that made him feel guilty. It's like the person who is the sinner shames everyone and, then ends up killing themselves because they feel so bad about their sin. So I wasn't 100% sure that he didn't have some kinds of inappropriate feelings toward his sister. But I don't think that the incest never happened, as far as I can tell. It was all something that he did to, I'm not 100% sure why he did it, but I do think a big part of it was to maybe try and, it's just, the thing is, if it's trying to bring back honor to his sister's name, it's like, really? That's your MO? Like, you're going to say you have incest instead, and somehow
it
that's
made no sense to me,
less
right?
disgusting than promiscuity?
At a certain
I don't
point,
know.
he had a knife. He was going to do a murder or I guess a suicide pact with her. But I suppose it's important. Yeah, I also don't think it's maybe the 100% reason why, but it was something around sexuality and maybe him being a virgin and him being around these sexualized people at Harvard, all these things, who knows? And perhaps, I thought maybe that episode with the little girl, where I suppose he was accused of kidnapping her and obviously, being up to no good in general, maybe it was the last, ditch of human hope he had, and it evaporated in being taken to court for it.
I think also you can't dismiss what his father, Mr. Compson, was saying about life, that it's absurd and has no meaning, and that comes up a lot in this chapter. He just brings that up a lot, and I think that was another thing. I mean, in other words, there were multiple elements, and I think the Caddy one was probably primary, but that fact that his father had that position about the absurdity and unimportance of life in every part of it was very hard on him.
Can I
Can
we read the quote? Because that was probably my favorite part of the book, was saying, okay, let me reread the quote by Shakespeare and see what it says before I start in on this book. And then it all was downhill after that. But I'm teasing.
It's okay.
A little bit. No, but the quote says, "Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." For me, I thought, gosh, that's so true. We go around, we have our lives, we don't know what the hell we're doing. We're all dealing with so much baggage and so much crap that we bring to our relationships, to our lives, and we spend a lifetime trying to figure it out. And I think a lot of us, don't. I think we just kind of die, and I mean, it's really not very positive outlook, but I think we kind of are just like, moving through life and trying to figure crap out, and we don't see how much I think if anything, the story just makes me think, my God, the way our culture and our family of origin mixes up to make us who we are, and then we set out believing that we're our own people making our own choices and not really seeing how much of what we do and how we behave is based on, I don't, it just in my opinion, all of these sort of social ideals that we have and these ways in which we were raised where we believe certain things about ourselves, about others, about our place in the world, and we're idiots. We don't know. We don't know what the hell we're doing.
Well,
and we make such a ruckus,
okay, yeah.
and then
let me just jump into something and back to Quentin a little bit from what you said, Jen. I don't know if you all remember the last line of the book, which last lines are kind of my thing, but it says a lot about what Faulkner was trying to do here. And I mean, I could bring it up later, but I'll bring it up now. Where is it? The broken flower drooped over Ben's fist, and his eyes were empty and blue and serene again as the cornice and facade flowed smoothly once more from left to right. Post and tree, window and doorway, and signboard, each in its ordered place. The thing that jumped out at me when I read that was the word ordered, because if there's anything that this book is just hugely characterized by is chaos. Its structure, the language, the lack of grammar. It's fascinated me that it ended with each in its ordered place, because I think part of what he was saying by this last line and about each character, but since we're talking about Quentin at the moment, about Quentin is that the chaos that Mr. Compson was talking about, that life is, and it doesn't matter, and Quentin could not handle that. And he was trying desperately to find order and hold on to order. And I think by committing suicide, he was able to achieve that. That's my sense of his character.
I agree with that. I think you're right with Quentin. I think he was he didn't have the self-protective measure that Jason had.
Yeah, narcissism.
Yeah, he didn't have that sort of thing where he was just an asshole and like nothing could bother him. So I think he cared, and he cared too much. And definitely, you're right. There's a lot of chaos, and I think that's a pretty fair assessment that he didn't have anything to hold on to anymore.
Right, and I know another thing, and I don't know, someone might have brought this up, maybe it was Dan, about time. Faulkner was obsessed with time, with the past and the future and timelessness. And that came out also in the Quentin chapter when he discusses Quentin's watch. You remember that?
Yeah, the whole chapter talks about time. Like it starts out with the ticking of the clock that his grandfather gave him, and how you can never control time.
Right, and I was fascinated when I read that, because I remember when I was a kid, I used to take my watch and, in order to fall asleep at night, put my watch up to my ear, and I would just hear tick, 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 and it would help lull me to sleep. And I was like, oh my God, and I saw him discussing actually the sound of the watch and listening to the sound of the watch. But that I know plays into Faulkner's sort of obsession with time. And obviously in the case of Quentin, trying to control time by breaking the watch, breaking the face of the watch, which obviously he can't do. Nobody can. But it goes to another thing about the suicide, is that's a way to control life.
So, we're kind of throwing together a couple things. So, just stepping back, the broken watch, why does he break, at the beginning of Quentin's chapter, the 1910 chapter, he breaks his watch, and that he breaks it around the time that we're told about his father's weird speech, right, about how nothing means anything. And
right.
Does he break the watch is some sort of strike against what his father was saying, some sort of response to what his father was saying?
I think it's, can I just read that part really quickly?
Yeah.
So this is, I suppose, just to summarize, this is, I think, Quentin talking, but it's his father talking to him about this watch. It says, "I give it to you, not that you may remember time, but that you might forget it now and then for a moment, and not spend all your breath trying to conquer it. Because no battle is ever won," he said. "They are not even fought. The field only reveals to man his own folly and despair, and victory is an illusion of philosophers and fools." So, to what you said, Daniel, I suppose that would make sense, that he kind of failed in the goal of this watch, and he is not able to forget this moment in time. He'll break the watch and kill himself.
So, one thing that really strikes me on this subject of time is that Dilsey, she goes to Easter Mass at the end, and It's a very good sermon, and she comes out saying, can't find the quote now, but I've seen the beginning and the end, essentially.
Yeah, I remember that.
I've seen the first and I see the last. That's what she says.
Right.
Never you mind me. And to my mind, there is a structure here of her vision contrasting with the father's vision of time. She has a meaningful vision of time, a sort of Christian idea of progression towards, the realization of God's kingdom somehow, versus an idea of time that is sort of cyclical. People rise and fall, kings rise and fall, but nothing is really permanent. I mean, I think that's kind of the idea of the father, and frankly, I think that's the idea of the famous Macbeth speech. The context of that speech is Macbeth trying to secure the Scottish crown, and through all sorts of murders and things like that. And he ultimately fails at the end. And when I think it's after he's learned that his wife has died, I think by her own hand, he says, in the beginning of the speech is tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow creeps in the petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. And then it goes into the part that Jennifer just mentioned. And I think the connection between honor and time is this: if you were to take the point of life as being, hey guys, let's be honorable, become kings, achieve great things, etc., you're going to have a cyclical, it's going to be tragic in the end in some way. I mean, nothing can last forever. And I think that's what the father was kind of saying. I mean, something is to keep in mind in the background here is the family's history. I don't know if anyone saw this, but after the novel was published, Faulkner wrote what he called an appendix, which gave the family's entire history from about 1699. And, supposedly the way that he described it in this appendix was that this is a family that, was a sort of Scottish refugee who had lost in a battle with the king and had to be left and had to leave. And, he ended up basically setting up a plantation in the South, and at least that's what the family did. And, they became kind of big muckety mucks in the South. There was a governor, there was a Civil War general, and progressively the family just sort of deteriorated. These are things that are kind of hinted at in the novel, but it kind of brings it into stark relief by what Faulkner wrote in this goofy appendix. And it's kind of like it's kind of the decadence of a great family is basically what it is. I mean, and there's and I think to my mind, this is a big idea of the novel is sort of the passing of the old South into a new South. And I can't help but notice that as the novel goes on, it focuses more and more on the black perspectives. And I don't know how much that's a conscious decision, but it seems really noticeable that Dilsey is the only sane one here, Dilsey and her family. And, between the two, you'd have to say that Dilsey and her family are just much better characters than the Compsons in terms of their morals.
I have to step in here about Dilsey, okay? Do you mind?
Go right ahead.
Okay. This is going to take a big chunk of time, so get your coffees together. I don't know if you all noticed, and I'm sure you did, the way the black characters were written up and their language. And at first, to me, I was really disturbed by that. But of course, here I am 100 years later, 10, 20 years later, reading this, and obviously many things have happened and we're in a different world. To be honest, I was reading, when I read a little of this book back in college, long story, but not the whole thing. And then this was the time that I'd read the whole thing, and I really loved it. I really loved it. I loved how difficult it was. I loved the lack of grammar and what that was doing. It's like process playing into content. I just loved it. But then I got toward the end, and I was reading Dilsey's chapter, and I started thinking, more and more about my problem that I've probably been trying to ignore, and it has to do with the racism. And so, and you're bringing up Dilsey, so that brings up this whole thing to me. And I wanted to discuss this article I read about this book that just came out about Faulkner. And I'm going to read a little bit from this book, and I want to get you guys' thoughts, because if there's one thing that we, as living in 2020, during all of the Black Lives Matter stuff we're going through now, and having been through the 60s civil rights and, all kinds of stuff, world wars, whatever, you must have a very sensitive and very a different perspective on the way these Black characters were written and how they behaved and how they spoke back in the early 20th century. Anyway, let me just say this. This is book that I came across. It's called The Saddest Words, William Faulkner's Civil War. And I'm going to read some excerpts from this article about this book. It's by this man, Michael Gora. The issues of race and history, so central to Faulkner's work, have grown only more urgent. How should we now regard this path-breaking Nobel Prize-winning author who grappled with our nation's racial tragedy in ways that at once illuminate and disturb, that reflect both startling human truths and the limitations of a white Southerner born in 1897 into the stifling air of Mississippi's closed and segregated society? In our current moment of racial reckoning, Faulkner is certainly ripe for rigorous scrutiny. Faulkner took liberties with the historical order of events. What he sought to depict was the psychological truth of the Confederate home front and the war's aftermath. This is work, Gora argues, that actual documents of the period would be hard-pressed to do, and that psychological truth certainly could not have been derived from study of the racist historiography of Faulkner's era, which he insisted he never read. Instead, this understanding is the product of what Toni Morrison has called Faulkner's, quote, refusal to look away approach to the burden of the region's cruel past. Faulkner, and the reason I'm reading this to you is because it has kind of broken my heart, and you'll see. Faulkner, Gora concedes, remained a white man of the Jim Crow South and did not always rise above it. At times, his words both can and should make us uncomfortable. His fiction offers an all too forgiving depiction of slaveholder paternalism. His novels and stories fail to render slavery's physical cruelties. They include no depiction of an auction, a family separated by sale, or a whipping. Many of his Black characters seem incomplete, although they're certainly not the caricatured stereotypes typical of so much white Southern writing of his time. Faulkner remarked upon white men who had the courage to endure, to resist Reconstruction. The unvanquished presence John Sartoris as a leader of the local Klan, admirably determined to keep, quote, the carpetbaggers from organizing the Negroes into an insurrection, end quote, which was Sartoris's view of the Black claim on the franchise. As Gora observes, Faulkner's picture of Black voters as inevitably ignorant and corruptible simply parrots the view of Reconstruction that was current in Faulkner's childhood and for some decades thereafter. A 1943 short story Faulkner wrote for the Saturday Evening Post presents the slave broker and Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest in a generous manner that Gora finds particularly hard to stomach. At the same time, Gora points out, the depiction of enslaved people fleeing to freedom and securing their own emancipation transcends the historiography of Faulkner's time and anticipates that of our own. He is no apologist for the Old South, Faulkner, and resists in any way glorifying the war, unlike almost every other white Southerner of his era. Perhaps the most powerful of Faulkner's tellings of the Civil War story is Absalom, Absalom, his 1936 novel, structured around Quentin Compson, because, a lot of his characters appeared throughout his novels, structured around Quentin Compson's own refusal to look away. Although Faulkner insisted that Quentin did not speak for him, Gora has never quite believed him. Quentin's search to understand why Charles Bond was murdered during the very last days of the war unfolds through his elaboration of successive narratives in a manner not unlike Faulkner's own. Unsatisfied with each version of the story he uncovers, Quentin Compson looks again, arriving through ever more disturbing revelations at the South's original sin, the distorting and dehumanizing power of race. It is race that pulls the trigger. To think of this novel appearing in the same year as Gone with the Wind is startling. It was Moonlight Magnolias rather than a searing portrait of the persisting legacies of slavery that captured the public's acclaim. Margaret Mitchell, not Faulkner, won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1937, but Faulkner's period of explosive productivity beginning in 1929 attracted a different sort of attention because of his formal innovations. And that's the thing that I was kind of trying to key into, Dan, when you brought up why did he start the book with this chapter. Where is it? His literary experimentalism, not just his unvarnished portrayals of race. In a 1939 essay, Jean-Paul Sartre compared him to Proust, and Faulkner became an idol in the eyes of young French intellectuals, as well as literary critics around the world. Faulkner might not have won the Pulitzer, but he was on the path to his 1949 Nobel Prize. Yet, having meticulously acknowledged all this, Gora makes his claim for Faulkner the writer by reproving Faulkner the man. When writing fiction, and this is again goes to that comment about the first chapter, when writing fiction, Faulkner became better than he was. He had, Gora argues, an uncanny ability to think his way within other people, to inhabit their being so as to erase preconceptions and prejudices in the very act of portraying their minds and souls. Through fiction, Faulkner could stand outside his Oxford, his Jefferson, and see the behavior his people take for granted, the things they don't even question. As Gora presents it, the act of writing bestowed an almost mystical clear-sightedness. Yet that clarity was always challenged in the fetid Mississippi air that Faulkner, like all his characters, had to breathe. And it is that very tension, the combination of the flaws and the brilliance that for Gora makes his case that Faulkner is a master. In his Nobel Peace Prize, this is my last paragraph, then I'll apologize. In his Nobel Peace Prize speech in 1950, Faulkner declared that the only thing worth writing about was, quote, the human heart in conflict with itself, end quote, which explains why a lot of what we read seems chaotic. He lived that conflict even as he wrote about it. His struggles forced him to experiment and to innovate, yielding both his aesthetic and his ethical insight. These very difficulties, the drama and the power of his attempt to work through our history, to wrestle or rescue it into meaning, are what make Faulkner so worthwhile. We read him because he takes us with him into our national heart of darkness, into the shameful history we have still failed to confront or understand. Our past, Gora and Faulkner agree, is never over. I apologize for the length of that, but I thought it was a really good, it's in the Atlantic, I thought it was an excellent article. And it cues in a lot of stuff, but what it did for me was underscore my feelings about how the black characters are depicted in this book, and trying to come to terms with that as someone in 2020 reading something that was 1920s. So anyway, I just found it fascinating. Anyway, thoughts.
I kind of wonder whether this was somehow him trying to, okay, let me back up. So he's clearly, this isn't just about the Compsons, to my mind. This is a larger kind of shift in history from the Old South to the New South.
Right.
And I don't know, it's such a weird, I think part of the reason why it ended up this way is almost possibly that he, I wouldn't be surprised, he was fairly, racist, but I kind of wonder whether, there's a weird way that you can be smarter in your book than you are in real life, right? And you can kind of be led along certain paths imaginatively.
Well, you see that in the way the black characters are depicted in Sound and the Fury?
Well, yeah, because you just think that they're the only ones who have their act together compared to the Compsons, and and Caddy and Quentin both leaving, right? So Caddy leaves because her possible marriage with the banker guy falls apart in 1910. She leaves her kid Quentin, her daughter, with the Compsons to be raised by them, and they raise her not well. She seems to be rather impulsive, and she seems to be constantly arguing with Jason, and Jason ultimately drives her out. She leaves stealing Jason's money. She leaves with her, I don't know, carny boyfriend or something. This guy who was, I think, a musician in a traveling band, she leaves with him in the night after stealing Jason's money, which is actually mostly the money that Caddy had been sending. God knows where she got it from. And I mean, presumably it's from prostitution, right? But
yeah.
So there's some, imaginatively, he was driven to, number one, this utter kind of symbolic violation of, the status quo with Quentin stealing all this money and leaving with the guy. And that's one progression. And the other progression is, as more and more time goes on, you kind of get more of a portrait of the black family that are, the help. And you just get a sense that these are just better people. They have better values. They, I don't know if it was meant to be Christian exactly. I don't know what Faulkner's own religious beliefs were, but there's some idea of like, you have to have a better value system that is working towards something greater than your own stupid sense of honor, right? That's kind of like, if you're honestly going to think that your own stupid honor is the most important thing, then life is going to appear like the tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow speech, where it's just, you have a day in the sun and then it's all decadence. Versus it's better to have a better value system, right? Like the kind reflected by the Dilsey's family.
I don't know if I see that though. I don't know if I see that the black characters, the way they're being depicted by Faulkner, as necessarily have it together better. They're in charge of running
better
things.
People.
Yeah, I'm not saying they aren't better people. I'm just saying the way that he's depicted them, I don't get that sense. I mean, they're definitely not as totally insane and, fucked up as the Compsons, but there's still a depiction of them that is disturbing to me,
I mean, that might be, but, Dilsey pushes back against Jason. She's like the only person that...
Well, she pushes back against
really
all of them,
challenge.
really, because she's been running things for so long, But at the same time, Luster, right, who essentially takes care of Benji, his disdain for Benji, but I guess he does love him in some way. I don't know. And I was not thrilled.
They seemed normal, though. I appreciated the way that they were written in, because they didn't seem some sort of proxy or metaphor for some sort of vigilance. They seemed like a very normal family that would be in the circumstances, given the circumstances, I should say. And of course, there were extraordinary circumstances. I wanted just to read the last bit of the appendix that was in my copy that was mentioned. And I think it ends with their characters. And under Dilsey, it's the last entry in the appendix. It just says, Dilsey, they endured.
Dilsey, they endured.
Yeah, that's all.
I think what's interesting about them is that all of this honor and Old South and everything, these weird rules and codes, I don't think they apply to black people in the South. So they have the freedom from some of that. The women have the freedom. I mean, the women in the Compson family are just, I don't know about Caddy, but like the mother, I just was not a fan. And they're just these weak.
No, she was self-pitying.
I don't know.
You're
Maybe
right.
I'm being too harsh.
She was self-pitying. It was
just
to
so
the nth
self-pitying
degree,
and
insanely annoying.
It was really bad. And I think part of the reason I hate this book is because I'm from the South and it's not that old. And this is still like pretty big way of life. I'm from the deep South in Arkansas, and I grew up Southern Baptist, and I grew up around a lot of this like macho bullshit. And like, I don't have a normal response to that. I have like anger about this book. And it's not the black white thing that bothers me. It's more of just the male, like, God, the whole Jason. It's just like I hate him. And he represents the worst of everything that is in the South in terms of the male and female dynamic. And, I know I find myself falling into it, like, can't do without men, and men are our heroes and they're our saviors and they control everything, and you want something done, a man's got to do it, and like the whole I don't know, it's just, so I hated all that. But what was interesting was that you could see that the black family were completely separate and apart from that. So whether that's true, I don't think that's true actually, in the actual South, but in the book, they didn't seem to be afraid of all of the dysfunction that comes from these kinds of honor codes and this sort of patriarchy. So I don't necessarily think that, I mean, they're better people. Yeah, they function better. But I think the biggest thing was just that they didn't have all that crap that they were dealing with. And I think that that was the point of the book, right? It's the fall of, France or something. It's the fall of a way of life, an aristocracy,
yeah.
a kind of caste system or hierarchy that it's just not working. And because you're holding on to something that doesn't have a place, and it's not all of the order and regulation and the way things were done, it fell apart. And so when you're still holding on to something, but you don't have the social mechanisms to keep it in its place anymore, then, it's a disaster, right? So at one point, that kind of thing worked really well. And as things became more modern, as jobs changed, as industries changed, as the way in which people interacted changed, and the access that people had to each other changed, all of that fell away and it wasn't useful anymore and it couldn't hold up. But then when you're holding on to that ideal, because it's not just a pragmatic approach, it's a very socialized into you way of thinking, it's very confusing. It's very, I think for Quentin, it was, very upsetting to see that his belief system and his abstractions about life just didn't match up with life. And that was probably very difficult for him. So yeah, I think the Dilsey, that family just didn't have the same kinds of mental garbage.
I came from the South too, although not the deep South, from Virginia. And I'll tell you one thing that is that I noticed that's similar is that I had, or my family had, a black maid, an African American maid, like Dilsey. But I don't remember when I was a kid that she was in any way demeaning. There was nothing. She was adored. And I'm not saying it's right. It's just a function of the time and the place. But what I saw in the way Dilsey is, I know that Dilsey has a strength that the Compsons don't have, and that's very appealing. But at the same time, I just felt that the way, and I think, again, back to what I read, I think it's hard to deny that Faulkner was a racist, right? Am I wrong?
Where do we see that?
Yeah, well, the way I would put it, you've read Letter from a Birmingham Jail, right? Yeah. And I wouldn't be surprised, it was the letter was very much aimed at a certain sort of, quote unquote moderate who kind of saw the problem and said, yeah, gee, we need to do something about that, but just never actually wanted to do anything very practical to remedy the situation. And I think my sense of Faulkner is that there's probably bits and pieces of like serious clannish kind of racism, and then there's but I think his considered view on this is probably like the kind of moderate that King was writing to, at least consciously. And I wonder though if in his fiction, which by all accounts was kind of, it's a little evert. I mean, it's a little like he wrote it as a compulsion or something. If his imagination kind of led him to a more interesting vision than his kind of lame, moderate stance in real life. That's what I wonder.
Yeah, I don't think he was racist. I kind of wondered how a person who could write this book could possibly be racist.
Yeah, I'm just not connecting. Maybe I'm just not connecting it to what are we referring to here.
I just feel like even the way their language is written.
Are you just mad that it's in dialect?
Well, that bothers me too.
I find it interesting that it is written sort of in a dialect kind of way, but I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing. Yeah, right. I'm not exactly, because remember when Reverend Shagag in the Easter sermon, he began talking as in a white in what's described as a white voice. Then he moves on, kind of changes register to a black voice, and it becomes sort of more impassioned and sort of powerful. And I don't know whether Faulkner, by putting the black people in this novel, by giving them a black dialect kind of rendering in the text, if that's meant as like a bad thing. I think that might, that might suggest a good thing,
I'm
right?
not saying they didn't talk that way. They did. I just...
Still do. Still.
Yeah, no. I know. I just
speak that way.
I know that I would expect it to be characterized that way. I felt I wish it had been the words I guess he wrote them as they sounded versus saying, I don't know. It just bothered me a lot. But I understand. And I also understand it's a time difference. I understand a lot of that. But let me just go back to this letter from Birmingham, the letter from Birmingham jail. I want to read this. This is from the same article I read before. In many ways, Faulkner was a quintessential white Southern moderate, an identity much scrutinized as the civil rights movement gathered momentum. He condemned violence and recognized the need to end segregation, but he rejected what Martin Luther King later described as the fierce urgency of now. By the way, that's very happening at the moment with Black Lives Matter. Indeed, it was the moral failures of just such moderates that King would directly assail in his 1963 letter from Birmingham jail. Faulkner urged patience and delay and spoke out against federal coercion of the white South. His critics thought he should have known better. As James Baldwin explained in his 1956 essay condemning the views on desegregation, Faulkner hoped to give Southern whites the time and opportunity to save themselves, to reclaim their moral identity, but their salvation could come, if at all, only at the cost of postponing justice for Black Americans, which Baldwin made clear was no longer conceivable. I see in Faulkner, when I'm reading about him, and not just reading what he's written, not just only the moderate thing, but a real sort of conflict of conscience, an internal conflict that, you can very easily say has a lot to do with the fact that he was brought up in Mississippi, as we all know. But it's disturbing. The Sound and the Fury is considered a literary masterpiece.
Yeah, I suppose I didn't read the secondary literature, but I think just within the novel, I'm getting a hard time interpreting within the novel as far as any sort of stance, liberal or otherwise, on the question of, being a racist or not. Obviously, in the novel, he's not like claiming there should be reparations or something like that, but I can't, take out any sort of policy prescriptions or his ideas of Black people at the time of the 20s within that novel. If anything, I would hold the same opinion. As already mentioned, that while they're not like heroic characters, I think that family is written quite well.
Yeah, I wanted to say on that note, I'm just curious. When I read this book, I don't read anything really into it. I just feel like it laid before you, and it's just this really in-your-face, accurate description of family dysfunction and the South, and it's just like it captures perfectly the way it was. It's as though you could take a snapshot of culture and put it on paper. That's kind of what he did. So I guess my question is, what is the point? Other than just capturing this, what is the moral of this story? You can't hold on to honor and things change. I don't know. I guess I just struggle with, other than really depressing everyone with the way everything was and how it changed is a little bit.
I feel that moral tale is almost that, multiple layers of metaphor on top of this Compson family in the South itself. And, the presence of, we were talking about the Dilsey and her family in the house is this, rediment of the system that's no longer sustainable. The family's decaying, their property's decaying, the South itself is decaying. And there's, it's that, basically. It's just showing this thing that actually, I forget if it was mentioned when this book was written, but at the time must have been even more prescient, right? Looking back at it with from today.
Yeah, I agree. I think it probably did mean a lot when it was first written. And I think just given the circumstances now that we weren't even in 5 years ago, it seems pretty relevant. It kind of reminds me of 100 Years of Solitude and that family and just this sort of...
Yeah, it's a good comparison. I like that.
We read that together, so hopefully you remember. It just feels like... And as I read that, I don't know, maybe my own family's just extremely dysfunctional, but doesn't it always seem that way? Like, doesn't it always seem like when you were a kid, you remember a time in your life when the family was a certain way and then it kind of just fell apart?
Yeah, about the time I turned 12 or 13.
Yeah, right. So I wonder if it's, just sort of the natural cycle of things and it starts up again. But yeah, I definitely think he was probably trying to speak to the time. But so nobody got any like hopeful messages out of it. Nobody got any.
Well, women's liberation with Caddy, right?
Caddy. Yeah, I feel like Caddy was like a small piece of hope, right? I don't know. Did anybody else think she was the most hopeful character?
Yeah, my sense was that Caddy and the daughter Quentin were the most hopeful characters.
I think I read somewhere. I'm sorry, go ahead.
And they had to escape, right? That's kind of, what does that mean? It's not like a message novel, right? But like you kind of think about it and think this does have certain sort of implications for what you think vis-a-vis the kind of culture that the book is representing.
I think I read somewhere that Faulkner said this was a story about those two women, about Caddy and Quentin.
Yeah, and it's curious that they don't get their own chapters, right? I think they are really the things that create a story here, a drama, and they are definitely the focus of attention of all the other male characters who are actually telling the story. One of the interesting things about Caddy is that she's kind of a mysterious figure, right? We don't really see her from the inside. She's constantly layered over with other people's thoughts about her. Benji kind of I think Benji has this weird incest thing going on with Caddy too. I mean, he, or at least, is incredibly fond of Caddy. Right, that she smells like trees, and this is the intellectually disabled sibling. He obsesses about her to the point where if he hears on a golf course someone say Caddy, he screams like in agony. And Quentin has this weird obsession with her too. He as we said, he tried to cover up her out of wedlock marriage by claiming that he had incest with her, which is like the weirdest cover up, because why would you it's such a weird way of covering up the supposedly greater shame of having an out of wedlock child, is I had incest with her. Right.
It's like, I want to cover up that I stole your pencil with a murder. I was murdering somebody.
Right.
Oh, sorry.
Jason also has this weird obsession with her. So the background of that is that Caddy is sending money from her prostituting, I guess, to the Compson family to pay for the daughter Quentin, her expenses, and to go towards her bank account, I guess. And instead, Jason secretly kind of embezzles it and hides it in a safe in his closet along with his own money. And that's what the daughter Quentin ends up stealing and running off with. But Jason has this whole attitude towards Caddy in his chapter, the third one, the April 6th chapter, where he is just nuts. He's like, it's almost like he wants to get some sort of symbolic revenge against Caddy, in my mind. I mean, one of the things that he hates is that he has to raise this kid that isn't even his, and he kind of plays out his resentment against Caddy on Quentin, I think, to some extent. And it's no wonder that Quentin becomes rebellious. So all three brothers are like weirdly obsessed with Caddy, to my mind.
That may be why she didn't have her own chapter.
Yeah. Well,
I think, for her to have her own chapter would have been probably, I don't know, beside the point, because, right, she rejects all of this. So if she had her own chapter, I think we would have to see that inside dialogue. And I think you're supposed to kind of figure some of that out, where she rejects all of what's going on in terms of her family. But like, people are not promiscuous. Young girls are not promiscuous for no reason. So she is doing this as a way to assert her own sense of agency and her own sense of, like, in my opinion, I think she's just saying, like, it's a giant fuck you to the family, Like, this is all bullshit. Everything you're talking about is bullshit. She sees through all of it. She thinks it's all garbage, and she thinks the way that her family behaves is. And she says, like, she doesn't exactly like being promiscuous. So it's interesting that she does it. And I think I would be pretty resentful at the fact that my mother was just completely absent. And, she rejects Benji. The mother rejects Benji. So Caddy's like the only one with
you remember when she was meeting with Jason in the, to give him money and to, remember in town in the Jason chapter?
Yeah.
I mean, you do get a sense that she misses her daughter so much. She wants to be a part of her daughter so much. But Jason won't let it happen, right? As I recall.
Well, and what's weird is that she's like, she says she's crazy and she can't take care of her, right? What are you doing? Do you think these people are sane? Like, I don't get that part, but she's definitely got a lot of inner conflict. It would be interesting to see what her chapter would look like, but I don't know that it would work, because so much of this is based on not really having a lot of self-reflection. And I think she probably has more than anybody else. And And I don't think that Benji was obsessed with her in a sexual way. I think that Benji was always 3 and Patty was his mom.
Absolutely.
I think it was 100% like just attached to her like a mother figure. And, the whole leaves thing, he's very sort of primal. And I just think she was his touchstone.
Cesare, do you have to leave?
It's fine if I don't want to cut the conversation. This was a good thread. So yeah, I can slink off silently. That's fine. I agree with the the assessment that Benji was just stuck being 3. He was later castrated, right, and eventually sent to a mental institution, but it was for a separate incident.
Was that the one where he grabbed that girl?
Yeah. I think Jason in his chapter refers to him as a gelding.
Yeah, they said how he was castrated right after that.
Yeah.
Where is that?
I know it's at least written in the appendix, but I'm not sure if it's filtered through the actual novel.
I read, you read through these secondary sources and you come across people who made all these charts and timelines and trying to figure stuff out because everybody's trying to figure out this book, what the fuck happened in this book. And I was looking at a timeline and I saw things. I was like, Benji was castrated? Where? And I went hunting through the book trying to find where he was castrated. But that's just a fact, not that it was in the book, you're saying.
I know in the book, Jason does refer to him as some sort of gelding, which would indicate that it was done by the time it was his chapter, but I forget exactly where.
And the other problem I had was, well, 2 things. One, I wonder if Faulkner didn't write Caddy's chapter or more from Caddy's point of view or Quentin's, the little girl's point of view, because he couldn't write from a female's inner self. You don't think so?
I don't think so.
I mean, you would have to do a thorough review of his.
Well, even still, I think he did kind of, just in the few lines of dialogue that he gives to Caddy, there's a whole lot there. Like she says, when men touched me, I died, or whatever. Like there's a lot that he says that, and even the way that he documents in this book, the way that men see women, all women are bitches or, all these different things that he says. I always see that as a harsh truth that he's saying, as though, as a author, he's critical of it. It's not like he's sugarcoating it. It's not like he's making it sound better than it is. I mean, he's saying it so well that...
You don't think he would have trouble writing from a female's voice?
Not at all. I think he definitely understands female. I think it seems like from what I read in this book, he understands the female perspective. I think he understands a lot. It's crazy to me. You have to admire just his talent in the sense that he just gets it so right, in terms of how people are dysfunctional and what they say and how they think. Jason and
but you hate.
I don't know. It's oh, I do. I hate the book. I hate the book. I only hate the book because I just.
Okay, all right, there you go.
I read, like, very nice.
You hate it because it's difficult. Because it's like this puzzle where you have to put it all together. It's like.
I don't like stream of consciousness. I don't love the idea of using the lack of grammar as some sort of a method by which to convey an idea. I know some people really love that.
That's interesting you bring that up because I read that when he first brought the draft to his agent, he said, this is probably the best thing I'll ever write. They did try to, in editing it before they published it, tried to put in the grammar, and he threw a fit, said, I do not want grammar in there. Yeah,
and it's like, you can go into a house and see a beautiful house and know that it's very well done and just not like it. And I feel like that's this book for me. I know I can see that it must have taken a lot of editing for him. He must have had to, I can't even imagine what he went through to decide put Benji first, because he didn't write it first.
No, he did. He did write it first.
He did? He wrote it first. Okay, so he must have had the storyline.
His drafting of this is that he had a short story which had similar characters, and then he kind of wrote a Benji section first, which kind of came as a sort of fevered passion, and then he wrote the other chapters almost trying to go over the same ground again. And he ended up, after he wrote those 4 main chapters, years later he wrote the freaking appendix, which is seriously the weirdest thing one of the weirdest things I've ever seen an author do, where it's like, you can't let this go.
Well, I mean, he might have gotten, I don't know, I haven't really tracked experience after he published it, but he might have gotten a lot of criticism or a lot of people screaming, what the fuck is happening in this book,
Right, well, that too.
Because it is kind of weird that he would do that so far after, but also, like I say, it is considered a masterpiece, and it mostly because that it did usher in stream of consciousness writing and a new modernist approach to writing. He was really at the forefront of that.
Yes, I think it's really noticeable how different this is from, I mean, this was published early 1930s or something. I mean, there had been, Ulysses was published at least about a decade before, and you also had The Wasteland published around the same time.
Yeah, but The Wasteland was a poem.
Well, yes.
I mean, think about how many people.
It's a similar. So I'm trying to get to my point here.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
So Ulysses, to my mind, I mean, both. I think in both Woolf and Joyce, the stream of consciousness feels a lot different. In Joyce, at least, it is very much about, kind of trying to represent the everyday and kind of valorizing everyday life, right? His whole kind of transubstantiation of everyday life into something beautiful. I know less of Woolf, but, I think she also kind of had a similar kind of vision of taking everyday moments and making them something beautiful, right? And I don't really see Faulkner as doing something like that. I don't see him as being about, I'm taking the everyday and making it something beautiful. It's something more like...
No, because he's going inside. I'm sorry.
I think it's something more like The Wasteland. I think, the ethos of The Wasteland is we have a culture that is totally broken apart. It's non-functional. It's very much an attack on what we've become. And and it kind of gradually, the Wasteland shifts towards a vision of, I don't know, it's kind of ambiguous at the end, but it's something better or different, or trying to grab something from the wreckage, sort of. I forget what that famous last word, Shanta.
Yeah, I can't remember, but you're right. It's trying to get to something different.
Right. And I think when I look over this whole book, the basic structure of it, moving towards Easter, moving away from the Compsons quite literally in the plot with what Caddy and Quentin do. And I kind of wonder if, I mean, it's a little, to my mind, it's more of a wastelandy kind of sort of vision of what to do with modernism, of trying to pluck figure out what to do with the ruins of our culture. I think that's sort of the idea.
Yeah, and I don't disagree, but again, like The Wasteland is a poem, which I don't know how many people would have been connected with that as they would a novel by a very well-known Southern writer.
I think that's kind of arbitrary, distinction. I mean, I think that people read novelists read poets.
I agree.
I mean, and Faulkner began as a poet, remember?
Yes, no.
Nothing
I
else.
understand, and I agree. And I agree with your connection to the Wasteland, but the difference I see in terms of the stream of consciousness, the modernist sort of effort on his part is that it goes inside the human psyche.
Right. Fair enough. I mean,
I think, because like when you think of stream of consciousness, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Jack Kerouac.
Yeah.
On the Road. Like, I feel like you can follow a long stream of consciousness. So this is almost not that. I think I use that shorthand, but it's more like intrusions of memories from your depths of your psyche into like everyday life. So it's kind of like a mix between a narrative and these intrusions. So it's not really stream of consciousness, because I feel like you can follow stream of consciousness, right? So I think what's aggravating about this is that it's just so hard to follow what the hell is going on because it's not clear. And I don't think that's necessarily the case.
I don't disagree. And I think you're right. But because this is an examination, a blow up of the internal human psyche, the workings going on inside, it's not surprising that it's going to be the chaos cannot be minimized.
Yeah, that's
exactly. I can see that. That's why when I was reading it, even though I didn't know what the fuck was going on either, but I just kind of put myself into a sort of different portal of existence and just sort of let it go. Just let the words hit me. And it was a long time before anything made sense.
I couldn't do it the same way. That I feel like that's a good way to do it, though, is to get yourself into some frame of mind, because I remember having to do that for Proust. Once you kind of got into the flow and you could follow what was going on, follow the way he wrote, then you could get into it. But this one I just never could.
Yeah, I think you just have to let it move, and you're just there, and let it hit you or let it work into you and just roll with it. And the thing is, we're coming at it, and this is, maybe this is why it's been named such a masterpiece, or maybe why it's, I don't know, been screamed at by so many critics, is that we bring, all of us here, sitting here today, we bring a very sort of intense structure that we have been raised with in terms of reading, in terms of how we look at a book or a story. And it has to do with a linear progress. It has to do with plot. It has to do with things that we're not even aware of, but have been a part of us since the beginning of time in terms of how we read books, particularly novels, fiction, stories, etc. So, it's like an immediate thought. It's almost like, I don't know, it's like the blood flowing through your.
Because we're so plot driven. Yeah, we're
Absolutely.
such a plot driven society, and to have a situation where you're just experiencing the world of these people, and you're there. You don't know the plot. You don't necessarily need to know the plot yet. The point is that you need to experience what they're experiencing. That's really tough, and also how much the author tells you what and how to think. It becomes very apparent when you read this book. You're like, oh, actually, like Jane. I mean, Jane Austen is such a simple writer
It's
compared
night
to
and day.
this. And she tells you what to think and what she thinks, and you just like it because you like what she thinks, and it's so comforting in that way. And this is not that at all.
And I don't think I guess what attracted me to it was that it was very uncomfortable. And not that I don't. My favorite writer is Virginia Woolf. So, and I'm not saying that she doesn't make you feel uncomfortable, but it's rare. She just makes you feel wonderful on many levels. But I really was really attracted to the uncomfortable feeling I got reading him, because it made me think, why is he doing this to me? Why am I bringing this to this? What is going on here? It was a fascinating experience of learning.
I totally agree with you on that one. I was like, yeah, probably I have these strong feelings and I should look into that. And like the reason I have these feelings is because
I know.
Such a visceral
exactly.
book to
and
read.
I think that if we try, and it's hard, it's really hard because we are structured a certain way. This goes into the whole philosophical debate about existentialist fact, or not fact. How much is fate part of our existence? How much is fate part of everything? And, the fact is that we are raised and born, and our mind thinks that way in a very linear beginning and end. Very straightforward. What's happening, going from beginning to end? What is and a plot-driven thing, and we have to work hard to separate ourselves from that.
But it's funny though, because we are, and yet the past, like he's trying, I think, to say in this book that the past keeps intruding upon you, and the past is not history; it's not even the past, or whatever that quote is. I think he kind of the way that he looks at time, and I think you could talk about time just for an hour in this book and try to figure out what it means, because the fact that Benji, the very beginning narrator, has no concept of time, and that one jumps all over the place much more than any other chapter, and you cannot tell. Honestly, I listened, and maybe if I read 3 or 4 more times and I know the plot really, really well, then I'll be able to discern when he's jumping. But I was like, I'm going to pay $412 for that color-coded book that he had printed just so I could see what time he's talking about, because it's very confusing. And
I ended up color-coding it myself. I don't know if I got it right.
Oh, that's interesting. But just the idea that Benji serves as, I don't know how else to describe it. It's really bad use of words, I guess, but as the sort of like, not just Christ-like figure or the moral figure, but almost the guideline for the book. The way in which his experiences jump all over the place, and they're as real to him as anything that's happening presently. And the way that that's kind of what's going on for these some of these other characters, Quentin especially, but Jason too. Past comes in and it affects you, and you don't realize that it's affecting you to the degree that it is, because you kind of, whatever's right in front of you is happening.
On that point, it's worth noting that Dilsey describes Benji as a child of God at one point. The other thing about it, I kind of, there are 4 chapters. It takes place on an Easter, mostly it takes place over the course of an Easter weekend, with theoretically the first, there is some sort of Christ thing going on. I don't know if it's Benji. Is it Quentin dying somehow? Like, is there, I don't know how to map the dramatic incidents of the novel to the Easter story.
I've seen critics say that Benji is the Christ figure in this story.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Okay. So there you go. The critics are
Aren't
right.
they always?
No, but I think he...
How would he be a Christ
obvious,
figure, though? So what does that mean then? Like, what? It's not enough to
Okay,
identify.
so like, did you ever read?
Someone.
Did you read The Idiot at all? Like Dostoevsky's The Idiot.
Yeah.
Right, but what does that mean for us? I mean, what does?
So
Go on.
like for example, if you were to go back and did you read this once or just once?
I read it
Because
twice.
if you read it twice, once you go back through and you read Benji's chapter over again, you kind of see how Benji serves as, I wouldn't say Christ figure in the way that like he dies and he suffers for them. And I don't know that Christ figure is the right word, but he's like the moral mirror. Like he reflects back what like morally. So for example, the way he sees Caddy, right? He doesn't see Caddy the way that I think a lot of the book portrays her, which is sort of like this poor, promiscuous, whatever. He sees her as the only person who ever showed him really like love and kindness. And I think he does some things in here with Quentin too. It's been a while actually since I read this, but yeah, you can see how he just reflects back it's like he's like this neutral person who sees everything and experiences everything, and he reflects back to the reader the morality of each character or something along those lines. Does that make sense? Did you get any of that as you read through?
I think one of the interesting things about that is, I mean, he's obviously in a funny way objective, right? Because he's sort of like he doesn't, he has very kind of minimal kind of goals in life, and so he can kind of just see things as they are to some extent, even though, it's kind of seeing everything at the same time and blended together all different times. I think there's some way that he kind of is a mirror. I mean, he's kind of like a moral test, right? Of, are you going to actually keep this kid in your family, or are you just going to send him to the state institution to take care of him? And Caddy.
Well, yeah, that the way his family receives him. That's exactly it. The way his family receives him. That each member, the way that they receive him, is sort of revealing of who they are. Even his mother, who changed his name from Maury to Benjamin, so they wouldn't embarrass the uncle, and how Jason only talks of him like he's just like this like an animal, like he doesn't have any feelings, or he just shows no care. But Caddy does.
I think we probably should do favorite lines.
Sure, and I have a long passage actually as my favorite line. I'm sorry to say.
That's all right.
Okay, I don't have a favorite line, so that's good. You have to just. I don't. I'm sorry, I couldn't.
All right, but before we do that, let me ask one question. You know how Quentin kills himself?
Yeah, but drowning.
Where is that?
Irons or whatever. I don't think it's in the novel. I think it's all just supposed to be something that you kind of figure out retroactively from the fact that he's buying irons, and I think there's some reference to drowning.
I would not have. This is an example of like I would not have known that if I had not read summaries of the story. That's the thing that like makes me so mad about this is like, God, do we have to work so hard? I mean, I appreciate that you're being experimental, but do we really need to work this hard? Is this the only way that you could convey the story? That I have to read other people's information? I don't know. I just feel like if I can't read a book on my own and figure out what's going on, it's definitely a reflection of my reading level.
No, it's not. It's not, because I had the same issue. I kept,
but my God,
I swear to God, I even Googled what point does Quentin actually kill himself, and I couldn't find it. I mean, it's not you.
I mean, to be fair, after I knew that and then I listened to the book again, I was like, oh, wow, that was really subtle. And I do think I know when they talk about it. Maybe. I can't tell you now because it's in audio. Right. But I kind of was like, oh, okay. After I kind of went and cheated and like read basically all of the story in sort of narrative form, like the plot line, this is what happens, this is how it happens, as though it's so easily understood. Then I went back and listened to it, and then I was like, all right, I see that, I get that, but even still, it's not like I memorized it, so I still was lost. I mean, you'd have to do it like, for me, I'd have to do it like 3 or 4 times to really know. I'd have to know the plot line really, really well, and then go back and listen to it again or read it again. And then I think I could get a lot out of it. But it's just like, I'm not going to invest 5 readings of this book, which I think is what it takes, quite honestly, to really get what you need to get out of it.
Do you remember the video games where they were like puzzle games like Myst? And there was, you could theoretically look up all the solutions to the puzzles in some sort of book, but you knew that you couldn't. If you were to do that, then you just ruined the game, right?
Exactly.
So, Like, and I have to admit, I think I made it through, I made it through the Benji thing. And then I got through about half of Quentin's 1910 chapter. And at some point I was just like, my God, like how I can't do this anymore. But it's a strange thing. I think when I read As I Lay Dying, I didn't cheat quite as much. But the thing in there is that you don't know who's speaking in a given chapter. And at some point I just kind of broke down and just wrote the names of the people who were speaking in particular chapters in As I Lay Dying. I mean, it's just an unavoidable sort of part of the experience of the book of reading like a Faulkner novel is inevitably running into the explanations of what the hell is going on. I don't know if it's a failing, but it's some sort of weird, inextricable part of reading a novel, a puzzle novel like this, is kind of breaking down after a while and, trying to figure out what the hell is, all the things that you missed. I mean, even when it was published, supposedly it was sent with a little kind of explanation of the basic outline of the novel and what the hell is going on and how to read the Benji section. Yeah. So it's not, I don't think that like people should beat themselves up over it, but it's almost like inevitable that for this kind of modernist puzzle piece thing that you're going to have to resort to an explanation.
Or be comfortable with not understanding or not knowing.
Yeah.
No, seriously.
I mean, I think the thing is, if you read the book and you don't know who's talking half the time and you can't really fully explain the plot line, you can still say a lot about it, which is interesting because I'm saying a lot about it and I still fully don't. I mean, I know what you've all said and I get it sort of, but I think there's just a lot there in the text about Southern life and all of the feelings of, this dysfunctional family. So you can say a lot, but it's just, I don't know. I feel like, why couldn't he just have said who's saying this chapter? Just name the chapter Joe or whoever. I've not read that book. But why do we need to have such mystery? Why do we need to make people work so hard? I guess I kind of think that's annoying. And it sort of seems arrogant to me. And why? Why do we have to go through such a struggle to understand what is going on? And maybe I'm just not in the mood to do that right now. So,
all right, maybe another time. All right, you want to? Yeah. Oh, you don't have a favorite line, and Nathan doesn't have a favorite line. So, first, I'll give you Cesari's favorite line, okay, and then Dan, you can do your passage, okay?
Okay.
All right. So apparently, I think didn't Cesari say it was the first line in the Quentin chapter, which is when the shadow of the sash appeared on the curtains. It was between 7 and 8 o'clock. And then I was in time again, hearing the watch, which I like very much. All right. Go ahead, Dan.
Oh, do we have a favorite line?
Me? I have a favorite line, but you can go first.
You save it for last. Okay. All right. So this is from the part where Dilsey goes to the Easter sermon. It's at a black church. It's a guest speaker, I think named Reverend Shagag. And the passage is describing him preaching. So here it is. When the visitor rose to speak, he sounded like a white man. His voice was level and cold. It sounded too big to have come from him, and they listened at first through curiosity, as they would have to a monkey talking. They began to watch him as they would a man on a tightrope. He's a very kind of small guy, I guess. They even forgot his insignificant appearance in the virtuosity with which he ran and poised and swooped upon the cold, inflectionless wire of his voice, so that at last, when with a sort of swooping glide he came to rest again beside the reading desk, with one arm resting upon it at shoulder height, and his monkey body as reft of all motion as a mummy or an emptied vessel, the congregation sighed as if it waked from a collective dream and moved a little in its seats. Behind the pulpit, the choir fanned steadily. Dilsey whispered, "Hush now, they fixing to sing in a minute." Then a voice said, "Brethren." The preacher had not moved. His arm lay yet across the desk, and he still held that pose, while the voice died in sonorous echoes between the walls. It was as different as day and dark from his former tone. So he's speaking now again, right? From his former tone, with a sad, timbrous quality like an alto horn, sinking into their hearts and speaking there again when it had ceased, in fading and cumulative echoes. Brethren and sisterin, it said again. The preacher removed his arm, and he began to walk back and forth before the desk, his hands clasped behind him, a meager figure, hunched over upon itself like that of one long immured and striving with the implacable earth. I got the recollection and the blood of the lamb. This is Shagag talking. He tramped steadily back and forth beneath the twisted paper and the Christmas bell. These are two things in the church. Hunched, his hands clasped behind him. He was like a worn small rock, whelmed by the successive waves of his voice. With his body he seemed to feed the voice that, succubus-like, had fleshed its teeth in him. And the congregation seemed to watch with its own eyes, while the voice consumed him until he was nothing, and they were nothing, and there was not even a voice, but instead their hearts were speaking to one another in chanting measures beyond the need for words, so that when he came to rest against the reading desk, his monkey face lifted, and his whole attitude, that of a serene, tortured crucifix, that transcended its shabbiness, its insignificance, and made it of no moment. A long, moaning expulsion of breath rose from them, and a woman's single soprano, yes, Jesus. As the scuttling day passed overhead, I guess this is them leaving, right? As the scuttling day passed overhead, the dingy windows glowed and faded in ghostly retrograde. The car passed along the road outside, laboring in the sand, died away. Dilsey sat bolt upright, her hand on Ben's knees. 2 tears slid down her fallen cheeks, in and out of the myriad coruscations of immolation and abnegation in time. So it's basically describing. I said they're leaving. That's actually not true. Like it's describing Shagag's, go from a more formal tone to a more leaping tone. It's described as going from white to black. It's particularly that 2 tears slid down her fallen cheeks, in and out of the myriad coruscations being sort of a bright explosion, the myriad coruscations of immolation and abnegation in time. Okay, when they're finally leaving, then is when she says, I'd seen the first and the last, which seems to explain what she's seeing there in that moment when the 2 tears are falling down her cheeks. So to my mind, I think that's the climax of the book.
When she says
it
that,
casts everything in a different light.
When she says that, I've seen the first and the last.
Yeah, and particularly that moment of 2 tears slid down her fallen cheeks, in and out of the myriad coruscations of immolation and abnegation.
Yeah,
in time.
I like that line.
So it's somehow in and out of time.
Yeah,
right?
I love that.
Which kind of links up with Benji in a funny way, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's like a very good sort of.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I would think.
Except that I have one that might do it too. And this is in Untitled Chapter. And Father said, it's because you are a virgin, don't you see? Women are never virgins. Purity is a negative state and therefore contrary to nature. Its nature is hurting you, not catty. And I said, that's just words. And he said, so is virginity. And I said, you don't know. You can't know. And he said, yes. On the instant when we come to realize that tragedy is secondhand.